The amp was still warm. The last note had barely faded from the monitors when Jimi Hendrix set his Stratocaster down on the studio floor. Not gently, not with the careful reverence he usually showed the instrument, but with the exhaustion of someone who had been chasing a sound for 6 hours and still had not caught it. The engineer behind the glass watched him through the window. It was past 3 in the morning. Everyone else had gone home. And somewhere between the playback and the silence that followed, Jimi said something that nobody in his circle wanted to hear. He said he was done. Not done for the night, done with the band. But the full weight of that statement, what it meant for the future of rock music, what it revealed about the invisible war happening inside one of the most celebrated artists alive, none of that would become clear until much later. Because the story of Jimi Hendrix wanting to leave the experience behind was not a sudden decision. It was the slow collapse of a structure that had been cracking since the day it was built. To understand why Jimi Hendrix wanted to abandon the trio that made him famous, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the stages of London or the chaos of Monterey, but to the small, calculated decisions made in the months before the world ever heard his name. Biographies and first-hand accounts from that era describe a young guitarist arriving in London in late 1966 with almost nothing. No money, no reputation outside of a small circle of American rhythm and blues musicians who knew him as a sideman, no recording contract. What he had was Chas Chandler, the former bass player of the Animals, who had seen Jimi play in a Greenwich Village club and believed, with the kind of conviction that changes entire industries, that this quiet American could become the biggest thing in rock music. Chandler had a plan, and the plan required a band. Not just any band. A power trio. 3 musicians, maximum volume, maximum impact, minimum cost. The format was strategic as much as it was artistic. A trio was cheaper to manage, easier to tour, simpler to record, and Chandler believed that the fewer people on stage, the more the audience would focus on the one person who mattered. Jimi. The auditions were fast. Noel Redding showed up looking for a spot in the Animals, not knowing the Animals were already falling apart. He played guitar, not bass, but he had the right look, the right attitude, and he was available immediately. Chandler handed him a bass and told him to learn. Mitch Mitchell came from a different world entirely. A jazz-trained drummer with quick hands and an instinct for improvisation that set him apart from the steady backbeat players dominating British rock. Mitchell could follow Jimi into the strange rhythmic territories that most drummers would have stumbled through. He was the musical match. Redding was the practical choice. And right there, in that foundational moment, was the fracture line that would eventually split the entire thing apart. But first, the experience had to become the most exciting live act on the planet. And they did. In a matter of months. The speed of the ascent was almost violent. By early 1967, the Jimi Hendrix Experience was tearing through clubs across England with a ferocity that left audiences physically shaken. The sound was enormous, 3 people generating the sonic force of an orchestra. Jimi played guitar with his teeth, behind his back, between his legs, set it on fire at Monterey, and the world could not look away. The records came fast. The debut album arrived like a bomb dropped on the British charts. The follow-up pushed further, harder, and deeper into territory that no rock album had explored before. Critics scrambled for language to describe what they were hearing. Audiences screamed so loud the band could barely hear themselves. But here's the detail that most retrospectives gloss over too quickly. While the world was falling in love with the experience, Jimi was already hearing something else, something the trio format could not contain. During the recording sessions for the second album, engineers and producers who were present described Jimi staying in the studio long after the official sessions ended. Alone, or sometimes with guest musicians, he would experiment with sounds that had nothing to do with the power trio format. He layered guitars in ways that required 4, 5, 6 tracks. He brought in keyboard players and horn sections for informal jams that never made it onto the official recordings. He talked about orchestras, He talked about a bigger band with multiple guitarists and a brass section. He talked about music that moved like water, shifting and flowing without the rigid structure of rock songs. These were not idle fantasies. These were the early symptoms of an artist outgrowing his vehicle. The tension between what the experience was and what Jimi wanted it to become started showing up in the rehearsal room before it showed up anywhere else. Noel Redding was a competent bass player who had learned the instrument specifically for this band. He was reliable, professional, and deeply aware that his role was to support the lead guitar. But Jimi was evolving at a pace that left Redding behind. The bass lines Jimi was hearing in his head required a different kind of player, someone who could improvise freely, who understood jazz harmony, who could hold down a groove while simultaneously responding to the unpredictable directions Jimi took during live performances. Redding played what he knew. Jimi needed someone who could play what he imagined. Mitch Mitchell was closer to what Jimi needed. His jazz background gave him the flexibility to follow Jimi through sudden tempo changes and spontaneous key shifts. But even Mitchell had limits. The musical vision forming in Jimi's mind was bigger than any drummer could fill alone, and he was imagining percussion sections, multiple rhythm instruments, the kind of layered rhythmic foundation that funk and jazz bands used but that rock trios simply could not achieve. And then there was the other problem, the one that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with money, management, and the machinery that surrounds fame. By 1968, the Jimi Hendrix Experience was one of the highest-grossing live acts in the world. The touring schedule was relentless. Night after night, city after city. The same songs, the same explosions of sound, the same spectacle that audiences demanded and promoters paid enormous sums to deliver. Jimi was trapped inside his own legend. The audience wanted the showman. They wanted the teeth playing, the fire, the destruction, the raw spectacle that had made him famous. They did not want to hear about jazz experiments or orchestral arrangements or the quiet, introspective music Jimi was composing in hotel rooms at 4 a.m. There is a particular kind of prison that fame builds for artists who become famous for a specific thing. The world decides what you are, and then it demands that you keep being that thing forever. Jimi Hendrix was the wild guitar genius. That was the brand. That was what sold tickets and moved records and kept the entire financial machinery running. Any deviation from that image was a threat to everyone who depended on it. Managers, agents, promoters, record executives, even the other band members whose livelihoods depended on the experience continuing to deliver what audiences expected. But inside the prison, the artist was changing, growing, hearing music that did not fit the cell he had been placed in. The sessions for Electric Ladyland became the battleground where these tensions finally erupted into the open. Jimi had a vision for the album that was wildly ambitious. He wanted to create a double album that would blend rock, jazz, blues, funk, and electronic experimentation into a single cohesive work. He wanted total creative control. He wanted unlimited studio time. He wanted to bring in outside musicians, to experiment freely, to chase every sonic idea to its conclusion regardless of how long it took or how much it cost. Chas Chandler, who had been Jimi's manager and producer since the beginning, watched this process with growing alarm. The sessions were chaotic. Jimi would book 12-hour blocks of studio time and spend the first 4 hours just experimenting with sounds, layering guitars, trying different amp settings, pursuing textures that had no clear connection to any finished song. Musicians would come and go. Friends would drift through the studio. The atmosphere was creative but undisciplined, at least from a producer's perspective, as Chandler had built the experience on efficiency and impact. 3 musicians, tight arrangements, maximum commercial appeal. What he saw happening in the Electric Ladyland sessions was the opposite of everything that had made the operation successful. It was expensive, unpredictable, and increasingly difficult to steer toward finished, releasable music. The breaking point came quietly. Chandler did not storm out in a dramatic confrontation. He did, according to multiple accounts from people who were present during that period. He simply stopped coming to the sessions. The partnership that had launched Jimi Hendrix into global stardom dissolved not with an explosion, but with a slow, exhausted withdrawal. Chandler later reflected that he realized he could no longer guide an artist who had evolved beyond what he understood. With Chandler gone, Jimi had the creative freedom he wanted, but freedom without structure brought its own problems. The Electric Ladyland sessions stretched on for months. The costs mounted. The record company grew anxious, and within the band itself, the fractures widened into chasms. Noel Redding, increasingly sidelined by Jimi's use of guest musicians, began showing up to sessions less and less. He felt disrespected, undervalued, reduced to a spectator in a band that bore his colleague's name. The bass parts on several Electric Ladyland tracks were played by Jimi himself or by session musicians, and a fact that made Redding's position in the group feel more symbolic than functional. There were arguments, not the screaming confrontations that make for dramatic storytelling, but the quiet, grinding disagreements that slowly poison working relationships. Redding wanted more input. Jimi wanted more control. Redding wanted to tour and earn money from live performances. Jimi wanted to spend months in the studio chasing sounds that might never become finished songs. They wanted different things from the same band, and no amount of compromise could bridge the gap between a sideman's practical needs and a visionary's artistic demands. Mitch Mitchell navigated the tension more gracefully, but even he felt the strain. Jimi's late-night sessions often happened without Mitchell present. The drummer would show up to find that significant musical decisions had been made without him. Arrangements had been altered. Entire sections had been rewritten or replaced. The collaborative spirit that had defined the Experience's early work was giving way to something closer to a solo project with rotating accompanists. And through all of this, Jimi kept hearing the bigger sound, the band he actually wanted. There is a tape, often referenced in accounts of this period, from a late-night jam session where Jimi played with a group that included multiple guitarists, a keyboard player, a horn section, and 2 percussionists. The music on that tape sounds nothing like the Jimi Hendrix Experience. It sounds like a different artist entirely, someone working with colors and textures that the trio format could never produce. Wide, expansive arrangements that breathe and shift and evolve over long stretches. Rhythms borrowed from African and Latin traditions. Harmonic sophistication that owes more to Miles Davis than to Chuck Berry. That tape, if the accounts are accurate, represents the sound Jimi was trying to build. The band that almost was. By the middle of 1969, the Experience was effectively over, even if no official announcement had been made. The final performance came at a concert in Denver, Colorado, in June. According to people who witnessed the show, the tension between the musicians was visible on stage. The energy that had once made them the most electrifying live act in rock music had curdled into something stiff and mechanical. They played the songs, they hit the notes, but the spark that turns a concert into an event was gone. Redding left shortly after. Some accounts say he quit. Others say he was pushed out. The truth, as it often is in these situations, probably contains elements of both. What is clear is that by the summer of 1969, Noel Redding and Jimi Hendrix were no longer capable of making music together. The artistic gap between them had become unbridgeable. But Jimi did not mourn the end. He moved. Within weeks, he had assembled a new group, not the grand orchestra of his dreams, but a step in that direction. Jimi brought in Billy Cox, a bass player he had known since his early days in the Army, stationed at Fort Campbell. Cox was everything Redding was not, a deeply experienced musician with roots in rhythm and blues and funk, someone who understood groove at a molecular level and could lock in with Jimi's unpredictable rhythmic shifts without hesitation. Adding Cox changed the foundation of the music immediately. Where Redding had provided a solid but limited bass presence, Cox created a rhythmic conversation with Jimi's guitar that opened up entirely new musical territories. This expanded group, sometimes called Gypsy Sun and Rainbows, made its most famous appearance at Woodstock in August of 1969. The performance was messy, unrehearsed, and wildly uneven. The band had barely practiced together. The sound system struggled with the expanded lineup, and yet, in the moments when it worked, when the musicians found each other in the chaos, you could hear glimpses of what Jimi had been chasing. A bigger, more fluid, more rhythmically complex sound that moved beyond the limitations of the power trio. But Woodstock also revealed the gap between vision and execution. Having more musicians on stage did not automatically create the sophisticated, layered sound Jimi was hearing in his head. It created more variables, more potential for confusion, more moments where the collective energy scattered instead of focused. The Woodstock performance was a first draft of an idea that needed months of development, and the music industry was not going to give Jimi months of development. It wanted the next album. It wanted the next tour. It wanted the product. The pressure to deliver something commercially viable led to the next chapter, Band of Gypsys. This was the tight, a focused version of Jimi's new direction. A power trio again, but fundamentally different from the Experience. With Billy Cox on bass and Buddy Miles on drums, the Band of Gypsys leaned hard into funk and rhythm and blues. The groove was heavier, thicker, more physically forceful than anything the Experience had produced. The guitar work was still extraordinary, but it served the rhythm in a way that Jimi's playing with the Experience rarely had. And instead of the guitar leading and the rhythm section following, the Band of Gypsys created a collective groove where all three instruments contributed equally to the rhythmic foundation. The live album recorded at the Fillmore East on New Year's Eve, 1969 into 1970, captured this new approach at its most powerful. The performances were raw and immediate, driven by a rhythmic intensity that made the Experience's catalog sound almost polite by comparison. Jimi was playing differently, thinking differently, approaching the guitar as a rhythm instrument as much as a lead voice. The funk influence that had always been present in his playing, inherited from his years backing rhythm and blues artists on the Chitlin circuit, moved from the background to the foreground. But Band of Gypsys was also short-lived. Buddy Miles, while a powerful drummer, did not share Jimi's restless creative ambition. Miles was a showman, a crowd pleaser, and someone who understood entertainment in a way that sometimes clashed with Jimi's desire to push into unfamiliar territory. Their musical partnership produced extraordinary moments but could not sustain the kind of continuous evolution that Jimi demanded from every collaboration. There was also the business side. Jimi's management situation had become tangled in legal disputes and competing interests that drained his energy and complicated every creative decision. The Band of Gypsys album was partly produced to fulfill a contractual obligation, not purely as an artistic statement. The intersection of legal pressure and creative ambition produced music that was brilliant but constrained, powerful but incomplete, a fraction of what Jimi was capable of creating under better circumstances. By early 1970, Jimi was already planning the next iteration. He brought Mitch Mitchell back on drums, kept Billy Cox on bass, and began working on material for what would become his final studio recordings. The sound was evolving again, incorporating elements from every phase of his career while reaching toward something new. The funk grooves of Band of Gypsys merged with the psychedelic experimentation of the Experience era and the orchestral ambitions that had been simmering since Electric Ladyland. And then there was Electric Lady Studios. And this was perhaps the most concrete expression of Jimi's vision for the future. He had invested heavily in building his own recording facility in Greenwich Village, a state-of-the-art studio designed specifically to accommodate his working methods. No more booking expensive studio time by the hour, no more pressure to finish quickly. Electric Lady Studios was supposed to be the place where Jimi could finally work at his own pace, developing ideas fully before committing them to tape. He's bringing in the musicians he wanted for as long as he needed them. The studio opened in August of 1970. Jimi recorded there for just a few weeks before leaving for what would become his final European tour. The recordings from those sessions, later compiled and released posthumously in various forms, hint at directions that he never had the chance to fully explore. Longer compositions, more complex arrangements, guest musicians adding textures that no trio could produce. He is the sound of an artist who was finally building the vehicle that matched his vision. But time was the one thing Jimi Hendrix did not have. The European tour that began in late August was grueling. Jimi was exhausted, both physically and creatively. He was dealing with management disputes that showed no sign of resolution. He was carrying the weight of expectations from multiple directions: fans who wanted the old spectacle, musicians who wanted to collaborate, business partners who wanted commercial product, and his own relentless inner voice that demanded he keep pushing forward, keep evolving, keep chasing the sound that was always just beyond his reach. On September 18, 1970, in London, Jimi Hendrix died. He was 27 years old. The band that almost was never materialized, the orchestral rock vision, the expanded ensemble, the fusion of jazz and funk and psychedelic exploration that Jimi had been building toward for years, it all ended in a London flat before it could fully take shape. What survived were fragments, studio recordings that suggested directions, live performances that hinted at possibilities, and the testimony of musicians who worked with him in those final months, who described an artist on the verge of a transformation that would have reshaped popular music as dramatically as his initial emergence had. What makes this story more than just a footnote in rock history is what it reveals about the relationship between artists and the structures that contain them. The Jimi Hendrix Experience was a vehicle designed for a specific purpose: to launch an unknown guitarist into international stardom. It accomplished that purpose brilliantly. But the vehicle was never designed to evolve at the same pace as the artist inside it. Jimi outgrew the experience not because the band was bad, but because he was changing faster than any fixed format could accommodate. The power trio gave him a platform, but it also became a ceiling. The louder the audience cheered for the old tricks, the harder it became to introduce the new ideas. The more successful the formula, the greater the resistance to changing it. This is the tension that defines the careers of artists who refuse to repeat themselves. The audience falls in love with a specific version of you, and then it tries to freeze you in that moment forever. But real artists cannot be frozen. They keep moving, keep hearing new possibilities, keep reaching for sounds that do not yet exist, and sometimes the structures that made them famous become the very things they need to escape in order to keep creating. Jimi Hendrix spent the last 2 years of his life trying to escape the structure that made him a legend. He never fully succeeded, but the attempt itself, the restless searching, the willingness to abandon guaranteed success in pursuit of uncertain artistic growth, that is perhaps the most revealing window into who he actually was. Not the wild showman, not the guitar-burning spectacle, not the icon frozen in photographs and poster art, but a musician who heard music that did not yet exist and could not stop trying to bring it into the world, even when the world kept asking him to play the old songs one more time. The band that almost was remains one of rock music's great unfinished sentences. We know how it started. We can hear fragments of what it might have become, but we will never know the ending, because the artist who was writing it ran out of time before the final chapter could be composed. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about Jimi Hendrix and the experience he left behind. He was not running away from something. He was running toward something, a sound, a vision, a version of music that lived in his imagination and nowhere else. The tragedy is not that he wanted to leave the band. The tragedy is that we never got to hear where he was going.